Hello there. Welcome again to another adventure in out of. No, I'm kidding. Oh, this is getting out of control. Today, we're going to look about. Not look at. Today, we're going to talk about the 5 key elements it takes to tell a great story. For instance, have you ever noticed that whenever you get together with a group of guys, they're kind of just chatting it up, maybe having a barbecue, drinking drinks, and you find that they're coming up with all these stories that seem to one-up each other. And during this story, you recognize the fact that some people pay attention to certain people speaking and not to others. Maybe at first you think it's political. But if you pay close attention, you find out that they tell stories a little bit differently. You see, there are 5 elements that are needed to be able to capture people's attention, get them engaged in the process, and, more than anything else, influence them based on the point you're trying to make. So today, we are going to take a look at those 5 elements. So if you're ready, I'm ready too. Almost ready. Anyway, I'm your host, CJ Powers, and welcome to CJ's Corner. If you're new to CJ's Corner, please hit the subscribe button, ring the bell, do whatever it takes so that you can keep up with the episodes and find out what's coming up next. This is brand new. This is the 2nd episode, so I'm still trying to work out the kinks. But hopefully you'll be able to learn something in the process. So let's get started on the point. First, we're going to go over the 5 elements that it takes to get your story to work well. The first one is setting, the next one is character, plot, conflict, and resolution. Now, most of those you've already heard about, but maybe you didn't understand how essential it is to be able to really make a difference. So let's dive into them. Let's first start out with our setting. The setting is what kind of gets the story visualized in a person's mind. So with the setting, you're going to reveal a few things. You're going to reveal the genre, if there is one. Sometimes there's not. Sometimes there is, but you just don't have a category for it. You're also going to set the mood or the tone. For instance, if I start out a story saying, this guy was running down the street. He was moving as fast as he can, kept on looking back at the guy chasing after him with the gun. Okay, you know he's located on the street. That's the setting. You know it's fast-paced. Some kind of action is happening. So it's an adventure or an action story. So just by saying a couple phrases, you start to get a feel for what the story is all about. You also set the tone during this time. You know, if the person, it was a haunting Halloween night, lightning flashed, and the child slowly crept forward toward the staircase, wanting that Milky Way bar, but hesitant to get that close to the open door where sinister sounds were coming from. So the tone tells you that that's going to be a little bit of a thriller or a horror story or something that's going to have some kind of shock value. Location is also important. You don't have to describe it in full detail. You just have to have enough hints that the person can visualize it in their mind. So setting is very important. And you can do it within 1 sentence if you need to. Take 2 or 3 sentences, but don't get carried away. No one wants paragraphs of information to understand your setting. So once you've got the setting established, and typically with a story that you're sharing maybe in a business setting or a church setting or at the gym or with the buddies over roasting marshmallows along the campfire, whatever it might be, 1 or 2 sentences is sufficient. You can always salt in more detail later on. But next you have to introduce the character. you have to have a character that is going to move the story forward. All the action has to surround who that character is. Now, if this is a business deal, maybe that character is the customer. If it's not, if it's something where you're trying to make a point, you can talk about, this is what happened to this other person and the results they got. So there's lots of different ways of going about it. You need to decide what's best for you. The antagonist is another character. The antagonist is the guy who is causing all the problems. Maybe it's a boss that just won't put the funds through, or has put a ceiling on the funds so you can't quite get the stuff you need to do the job right, but you can get some of it. The antagonist puts obstacles in our path. So sometimes the antagonist is nature. Sometimes it's some technology that gets in our way. It can be lots of different things. Typically, you also have a mentor. In a business setting, if you're the salesperson, you become that mentor within the story. If it's a church setting, maybe the pastor becomes that mentor. Or maybe the story is about somebody else who is doing the mentoring. It doesn't matter. You just typically have some kind of a mentor if the story is long enough. If it's not long enough, just stick with the protagonist. And then any other supporting characters that you have. The only reason there's other characters in a story is so you learn something about the protagonist. Don't make the mistake thinking that that person is special and you need to spend time developing who they are in your story. No. They're there just so you can learn something more about the protagonist. Okay, so that's character. We've done setting, we've done character. Now it's time to move on to plot. The plot points are the most difficult to understand at times. I don't know why. They write out very simply. You have an inciting incident. That's the first step. And for some reason, people have a hard time getting this one to sit in their mind as an understandable thing. The inciting incident is anything that starts the story moving forward. You know, in movies, sometimes the person receives the phone call, or they get the notice from the doctor, or something shows up in the mail, or an accident happens outside of their house, or there's a weird glow in the sky. You know, it just has to be something that starts the storyline moving. The first turning point is that first twist where you think the main character, the protagonist, is moving in a certain direction, but something happens where suddenly they're headed this way. Now, eventually they come back to where you think they were supposed to be headed, because therein lies where the solution is, especially in the business dealing. But sometimes it doesn't work that way. Sometimes they just keep on moving on to newer places and newer ways of doing things until it becomes satisfying in of itself. Depends on your story. Next is the midpoint. So let me say real quick that if you break up your story into 4 sections, you have the beginning, the first part of the middle, the second part of the middle, and the ending. So you have 4 segments. 25% of your time is in each of those segments, approximately, give or take, depending on the story. In the beginning, the end of that first chunk is the turning point 1. In the middle of the middle chunk is that midpoint. And then at the end of the last part is the climax of your story, the punchline of your story, this time where all of a sudden everything makes sense. So those are just basically taking each of those 4 chunks and putting a highlight after it. Now, sometimes there's what's called a second turning point, and that's in between the midpoint and the climax. Not always necessary, especially if you're doing a business story. But the point is that at the end of each of these quarters of your story, you can have something heightened that happens, some big issue, something that turns or twists around the main character. So you could have a turning point 2, which would be located in between the midpoint and the climax. But again, not totally necessary. Okay, let's move on to the next section. Now, when you're looking at a story as a whole, and you're seeing it in 4 blocks, within each block also is a beginning, a middle, and an end. And inside of those blocks might be mini stories with a beginning, middle, and end. But there's one thing that you always have to drive the story forward, to get it from the beginning through the middle and to the end, and that is conflict. There's multiple kinds of conflict that you can have. You can have the kind of conflict that is based on the person's own self. You know, maybe they have an issue they're facing. They're scared to do a speaking engagement and they have stage fright. Maybe it's something about the main character that you're talking about as the audience is paying attention to who this person is. Maybe there's some form of Mother Nature that intervenes and causes issues, that creates the obstacles. For instance, one of the organizations that I volunteer with is a speaking club. And they were suddenly faced with COVID issues, and they were like, oh no, we can't meet in person anymore. That was the obstacle. That was the nature imposing itself. So they said, oh, let's go virtual. And sure enough, we all had to learn how to do talks on the camera, which of course is one of the things that led to this show. Sometimes it's the supernatural, the God factor. Sometimes it's technology. I mean, how many times have we heard stories about technology taking over mankind? And sometimes it's just society itself. You know, all of a sudden there's these different movements where our society seems to be split into extremes. We're not really split into a lot of extremes, but it seems that way because the media gets more ratings if they just talk about the extremes. So we tend to know about the extremes more than the normal stuff going on. So those are the factors that you can build conflict from. But your story has to have some form of conflict so that the people pay attention to the main character. They want to see how they're going to get out of that conflict. They want to see how they're going to overturn the pending consequences that are going to be coming about because of the conflict. They have to see or hear your next scene to be able to know how it's going to be resolved. That's the key to driving the story forward. Okay, so now we're at our last point. You have to resolve the story. There has to be some form of resolution. Within the resolution, you can share a solution. Maybe it's a business thing, and you're talking about all these factors and the return on investment and so on. And now picture this, what life is now like if you do have the equipment. Or maybe you're trying to encourage a buddy who is going through loss, and he has to understand and see some kind of a vision for a future life, something that gives him hope that allows him to move forward. Maybe it's talking about 2 different people that somehow slowly come together in your story to develop a relationship, a work setting maybe where these opposing people find something in common and become a great team that drives profits up in the business. Whatever it might be, the key is to make sure that the audience understands what the benefit is. And here's why. The reason you're telling the story is because you want everybody to follow your main character, starting with their normal type of life, just like you and me. They've hit all kinds of obstacles. We watch or hear how the person works through those obstacles, what solutions they find, and then how their life turns out beneficially for them. And we wonder ourselves, I wonder if I did the same things, if I bought the same product, will my life be just as good? That's the key. You want the audience to know and understand your benefit. Now, once they understand your benefit, you can move into anything you want to talk about at that point. You want to do a free trial? Go ahead, offer the free trial. You want to ask them questions so that you can better understand their needs, so you can talk a little bit more details about the feature, that's fine. Whatever it might be, once they understand your story and they follow the main character through to the end, they are ready to understand and consider what you have to say. The reason we use story is for two reasons. One, it's memorable. And two, it's entertaining. And if you go back to those root words that build the word entertainment, you find out that it means to open the mind. So if you want to give someone some information, you have to open their mind to consider it. And the story is the best way of doing it. Well, that's it for today. I know it was quite an overview. So next time, we'll get a little bit more in depth into one category so you can get a great feel for how to tell a better story in work or at home with the kids or wherever you might find yourself. Have a great day.